Get off my property or I'll call the cops! I'd been at my new farm for exactly 2 weeks when this woman stood at my gate screaming in my face. My red barn wasn't approved. The HOA president had actually called the sheriff on me for violations, even though I wasn't even part of their neighborhood. I stood there next to my old tractor, hay bales still scattered around, watching 2 deputies apologize for being called out on something this ridiculous. She smiled coldly, held up a fine notice for $12,500 right in front of me. But when I looked past her shoulder, out to that dirt road cutting through my property, the only way in or out for their entire subdivision, I realized something. I just wanted peace. But if they wanted war, I'd play by the rules. Drop a comment if you've ever dealt with HOA harassment. That confrontation came later. But it started on a quiet Friday afternoon in October. Around 4:30 p.m., when I was out fixing the fence line on the north side of my property, I saw the county sheriff's cruiser rolling up my gravel driveway, dust kicking up behind the tires, slow and deliberate. I set down the post driver, wiped my hands on my jeans, and walked over. 2 deputies stepped out. One was older, maybe late 50s, with a gray mustache and tired eyes. The other was younger, still had that clean-cut academy look. The older one nodded at me. "Afternoon. You? Graham Hayes." I said I was. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. "We got a complaint from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Says you violate several community standards." I almost laughed. I didn't. "Officers, I'm not part of any HOA. My property sits 400 feet outside their boundary. I made damn sure of that before I signed." The younger deputy glanced around, taking in the barn, the chickens, the tractor. He looked genuinely confused. The older one sighed and handed me the paper. It was typed on HOA letterhead, signed by someone named Brenda Whitmore. The list was absurd. Unauthorized agricultural structure, commercial vehicle visible from the roadway, prohibited livestock, non-compliant landscaping. I scanned it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe someone had actually spent time writing this. My first thought was, is this woman serious? My second thought was, she absolutely is. I looked back at the deputies. "I have the survey and deed in the barn. You want to see them?" The older deputy scratched his neck. "Yeah, we figured this was off, but we had to respond. Go ahead." I walked them inside, pulled the folder with my property documents, and laid it all out. Boundary map, title report, everything clean and recorded. The deputy looked it over and handed it back. "You're right. You're not in their jurisdiction. Sorry for the hassle. Mr. Hayes." I nodded. "Not your fault, but this woman really called you out here for this." The younger one spoke up. "You sure you're not in the HOA, because that complaint was really detailed." There was something almost apologetic in his tone, like he felt bad I was caught up in it. I walked them back to their car. Before the older deputy got in, he turned and said, "Just be careful. That HOA president's got a reputation. Real persistent type." I thanked them, watched them drive off, stood there in the fading light, holding that stupid complaint in my hand. That's when I looked out toward the southeast corner of my property, Old Mill Road, a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, cuts right through my land. It was the only way in or out of Meadowbrook Estates. I'd asked my attorney about it when I bought the place. He said it was an easement. Been there for decades. No big deal. They can use it. But it's still your land. I hadn't thought much of it then. But now, standing there with a bogus complaint and the sheriff's warning still ringing in my ears, I started thinking differently. A white SUV pulled up near my gate, just sat there, engine idling, tinted windows hiding whoever was inside, watching. After a minute, it drove off, slow and deliberate, like they wanted me to see them leave. I crumpled the complaint and tossed it in the trash bin by the barn. I told myself it was just some power-hungry neighbor on a bad day, that it would blow over once they realized I wasn't under their thumb. But I'd spent 12 years as an environmental lawyer. I knew what it looked like when someone bent the control rules. This wasn't about my barn or my chickens. This was about someone who thought proximity meant authority. And I had a sinking feeling Brenda Whitmore wasn't the type to back down just because she was wrong. I went back to the fence, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about that complaint, the detail in it, the certainty. Someone had been watching my property, taking notes, building a case against me for crimes I didn't commit on land I legally owned. It felt invasive, calculated, and it felt like the beginning of something uglier than a neighborhood spat. By the time the sun set, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to bend. I wasn't going to apologize for living on my own land, doing exactly what I bought this place to do. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. The evening air was cool, and crickets started their song, the kind of peace I'd been chasing for years. I looked out at Old Mill Road again, that little dirt path winding quietly through my property, and I remembered what my attorney had said: easement by necessity. They could use it as long as there was no other reasonable way out. But what if there was another way I didn't know yet? But I had a feeling I was about to learn. She thought the law was on her side. She was wrong. I didn't end up here by accident. 6 months before that sheriff's visit, I was sitting in a glass tower office in downtown Portland, staring at a contract I didn't want to sign. I'd been an environmental lawyer for 12 years, defending energy companies and writing legal briefs to justify projects I knew were cutting corners. The money was good. The work was suffocating. I was 39 years old and burned out. One Tuesday morning, I walked into my boss's office and quit. He thought I was bluffing. I wasn't. I'd always had this dream of owning a small farm, nothing massive, just enough land to grow vegetables, keep chickens, and live at a slower pace. My grandfather had a place like that in rural Washington, and I remembered the mornings there, the quiet, the way time felt different. I wanted that back. I started looking for property in late March. I needed something affordable, far enough from the city, and most importantly, outside any HOA jurisdiction. I'd seen too many cases during my legal career. Neighbors suing over fence heights and paint colors, people losing homes over unpaid dues. I wanted land that was mine, where no one could tell me what to do with it. I found the Hayes Farm property in late April, 18 acres, old red barn, a working well, and a small farmhouse that needed work but had good bones. It sat just outside Meadowbrook, about 40 minutes from the nearest town. The listing said it was outside all HOA boundaries. I made my real estate attorney, Ed Carlson, verify that 3 times before I made an offer. Ed was this older guy, late 60s, been doing property law in the county for 30 years. He laughed when I asked him to triple check. "Graham, you're lucky. The HOA next door is notorious, but you're clear, 400 feet outside their line." That was all I needed to hear. I signed in early May and moved in by the end of the month. The day I closed, Ed met me at the property to hand over the final documents. We stood in the driveway, and I asked him about Old Mill Road, the dirt path cutting through the southeast corner of my land. I'd noticed it during the walkthrough. Tire tracks, worn dirt, clearly being used. Ed explained it was an old easement, dating back decades. "It's an easement by necessity," he said. "They're allowed to pass through because there's no other reasonable way out. But it's still your land. You own it. They just have the right to use it. Shouldn't be a problem." I nodded. Sounded fine. I wasn't planning to block anyone. I just wanted to be left alone. The first few weeks were everything I'd hoped for. I spent mornings planting tomatoes, fixing the barn, and patching the fence line. I'd wake up at dawn, make coffee, and sit on the porch watching the sun come up. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of life I didn't think existed anymore. But while unpacking boxes in the barn one afternoon, I found something I hadn't noticed during the move. An old wooden file cabinet in the corner, covered in dust, was left behind by the previous owners. I pulled open the drawers out of curiosity. Inside was a box of documents, old land surveys, receipts, letters from the 1950s and 60s, and at the bottom, folded carefully, was a hand-drawn property map from 1887. It was faded, the ink browning at the edges, but the boundaries were still visible. I unfolded it on the workbench and traced the lines with my finger. The property had different divisions back then, parcels that didn't match the modern layout. And right there, running through what was now my land, was a notation in careful script: "Private road, access granted by necessity." I stared at it for a long moment. Something about that phrase stuck with me, though I couldn't say why. I folded it back up, put it in the cabinet, and went back to work. But in the back of my mind, I filed it away, just in case. For 2 weeks, Life was simple. I got 6 hens, let them free range around the property, bought an old tractor from a guy 2 counties over and spent a weekend getting it running. I wasn't trying to make money or build some empire. I just wanted to work with my hands, grow my own food, and breathe. For the first time in years, I felt like I could. Then the letters started. The first one showed up in my mailbox on a Thursday. Plain white envelope. No return address. Inside was a printed notice on Meadowbrook Estates letterhead. Dear property owner, it has come to our attention that your property may be impacting the aesthetic standards of our community. We request that you contact our office to discuss compliance with neighborhood guidelines. It was signed by Brenda Whitmore, HOA president. I read it twice, confused, then checked my property documents again. I wasn't in their HOA, I wasn't even close. I threw the letter in the trash and figured it was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. 2 days later, the sheriff came. That's when peace ended. The second letter came exactly 1 week after the sheriff left. This time, it wasn't a polite request. It was a certified notice, delivered by the Postal Service, requiring my signature. I stood at my mailbox on a Tuesday morning, coffee in one hand, envelope in the other, and I knew before I opened it that this was going to be worse. The heading read, Notice of Violation and Fine Assessment in bold letters across the top. Below that, a detailed list of every single thing they could think of to charge me for. My barn, my tractor, my chickens, my landscaping. Each item had a dollar amount next to it. Escalating in absurdity. At the bottom, in larger font, was the total. $12,500. Payment is required within 30 days, or legal action would be pursued. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe someone had the nerve to send it. I called the HOA office that afternoon. A woman answered, voice flat and administrative. I asked to speak with Brenda Whitmore. She said Mrs. Whitmore would return my call. I left my name and number. No call came. I sent an email the next day, attaching my property survey, my deed, and a polite but firm explanation that I was not subject to HOA jurisdiction. I hit send and waited. Nothing. 2 days passed, then 3, then a week. Silence. But that silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like someone sharpening a knife. On a Saturday morning, about 10 days after I sent that email, I was out by the chicken coop when I heard a car pull up. I turned and saw the white SUV, the same one that had watched me before. This time it didn't just idle, it drove straight up my driveway and parked near the barn. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in her late 40s. Blonde hair cut short, navy blazer, dark slacks, heels that had no business on a dirt driveway. She walked toward me with the kind of confidence that came from always winning. She stopped about 10 feet away, looked around my property like she was appraising it for sale, then looked at me. I'm Brenda Whitmore, HOA president. I'm here to discuss your violations. I stayed calm, kept my voice level. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not part of your HOA. My property sits 400 feet outside your boundary. I don't have any violations. She smiled, but it was cold, mechanical. You use our road. You affect our property values. By the spirit of community standards, you should comply. I shook my head. By the letter of the law, I don't have to. Her smile disappeared. She adjusted her blazer, tilted her head slightly, like she was deciding how hard to push. Mr. Hayes, your farm lowers the aesthetic appeal of the area. That impacts everyone in Meadowbrook. All we're asking is that you meet basic standards. This doesn't have to be difficult. I looked at her without blinking. It's not difficult. I'm not in your HOA. End of conversation. Her expression shifted. Not angry, but something colder, calculating. She glanced past me toward the barn, then back to my face. You'll regret this attitude. We have very good attorneys, and we will use every legal option available. She started walking back to her SUV, then stopped halfway and turned. Oh, and Old Mill Road. We're planning some major maintenance work. Might have to close it for a few weeks to repave and reinforce the surface. I hope you have another way in and out. She said it casually, like she was mentioning the weather, but the meaning was clear. She got in her SUV and drove off, slow and deliberate, leaving a trail of dust in her wake. I stood there, heart pounding, replaying what she'd just said. That wasn't a maintenance notice. That was a threat. She was telling me she could cut off access to my property anytime she wanted, and there was nothing I could do about it, except there was, because Old Mill Road didn't belong to her. It belonged to me. I walked back to the barn, pulled out my phone, and started taking photos. Not random snapshots, but strategic documentation. The barn from multiple angles. The tractor was parked exactly where it had been since I moved in. The chickens are roaming near the coop. The property line markers showed exactly where Meadowbrook ended, and my land began. Then I walked down to the southeast corner, where Old Mill Road cut through my property, and I took photos of that too. The road itself, the worn tire tracks, the way it curved through my land and connected to the main county road on the other side. I wasn't just gathering evidence, I was mapping leverage. She thought she could pressure me by threatening the road, but she'd just shown me her weakness. That road was the only way in or out for 82 families, and it ran across land I owned. That evening, I sat on the porch and opened my laptop. I started searching public records for Meadowbrook Estates, for Brenda Whitmore, for anything that might explain why she was so obsessed with my property. I found the HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, and financial reports, standard bureaucratic paperwork, and then I found something that didn't sit right. Brenda Whitmore had been the HOA president for 4 consecutive years. No one had run against her. No one had challenged her. She'd built a small kingdom, and no one had dared to question it. I kept digging. Property records, recent sales within Meadowbrook. 4 parcels of land had been sold in the past 6 months, all to the same buyer, Whitmore Development LLC, owned by Thomas Whitmore, Brenda's husband. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. This wasn't about aesthetics. This wasn't about community standards. This was about money, development, control. Brenda wasn't harassing me because my barn was ugly. She was harassing me because I was in the way of something bigger. I closed the laptop and looked out at Old Mill Road one more time. That narrow dirt path winds quietly through my property, the only connection between Meadowbrook Estates and the rest of the world, and it was mine. She'd come to my property, threatened me, and told me she had the power to shut me down, but she'd made a mistake. She'd assumed I didn't know what I had. She thought she held the cards. She didn't. The next morning, I drove into town to the county land records office. It was a small building tucked between the courthouse and the public library, the kind of place that still smelled like old paper and had filing cabinets older than most of the people working there. I walked up to the front desk and asked to see the public records for my property and the surrounding area, specifically anything related to easements and access roads. The woman at the counter nodded and disappeared into the back. She came out 10 minutes later with a stack of folders and a rolled-up map. She set them on the counter and said I could use the research table in the corner. I thanked her, carried everything over, and got to work. This wasn't research. It was reconnaissance. I started with a county survey in 1963. The boundaries were slightly different, parcels redrawn over the years, but Old Mill Road was there, labeled as a private access easement. Then I unrolled the oldest one on file, the hand-drawn cadastral map from 1887, the same map I'd found in my barn. But now its words carried new weight. I traced the line with my finger and found the notation in careful script along the margin. Private road. Access granted by necessity. I sat back and stared at that phrase for a long time. Access granted by necessity. That wasn't just historical language, that was legal language. It meant the road could only be used as long as there was no other reasonable way to access the property it served. If another route existed, the easement could be revoked. I pulled out my phone and started looking at satellite maps of the area. Meadowbrook Estates was bordered on 3 sides by private land and on the 4th by county-managed forest. But about 1/3 of a mile to the west, there was County Road 19, running parallel to the neighborhood. It didn't connect directly, but it came close. If that road could be extended just 0.4 miles through public land, Meadowbrook would have another way out, and the necessity clause would collapse. I took photos of every document, every map, every survey. Then I asked the woman at the counter if there was anyone who specialized in historical property records. She pointed me to a small desk near the back, where an older man sat reading a newspaper. She said his name was Hal Peterson, that he used to work full-time in the records office but now volunteered to help people navigate the archives. I walked over and introduced myself. Hal looked up, folded his newspaper, and smiled. He had to be in his early 70s, thin frame, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that looked like it had seen every boundary dispute in the county twice. I told him I'd just bought the old Hayes farm and that I was looking into the history of Old Mill Road. His smile widened. "You're the guy who bought outside the HOA. Good for you. That place is a nightmare." I asked what he meant. Hal leaned back. "Brenda Whitmore runs it like her own dictatorship. Nobody crosses her. But here's the thing. Her husband just bought 4 lots inside Meadowbrook in the last 6 months. All below market value. Way below." I felt my pulse quicken. "How far below?" Hal pulled out a notepad, scribbled some numbers. "Average sale price in that neighborhood is around $310,000. He bought 4 parcels for $185 each, 40% discount. And all 4 sellers were either on the HOA board or close to Brenda." I stared at the numbers. That wasn't just a good deal. That was coordination. I asked if he knew why Thomas Whitmore was buying up land. Hal shrugged. "About 3 months ago, I saw a development permit application filed under Whitmore Development LLC, something called Meadowbrook Resort and Spa. Big project. $3.2 million. They wanted unified architectural standards and convenient road access for the whole area. It got pulled before public hearing, but the paperwork's still on file if you want to look." I asked where. Hal stood, walked me to a filing cabinet near the zoning department, and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was a preliminary site plan, a cost estimate, and a letter of intent. The project site was outlined on a map, right next to Meadowbrook, with a note that said the development would increase surrounding property values and create a cohesive upscale community. I read through it twice, and then it all clicked. Brenda wasn't harassing me over HOA rules. She was clearing obstacles for a multi-million-dollar resort project. My farm, with its red barn and chickens, was a visual blight that would hurt marketability if she could force me to comply, or better yet, sell. The area would look clean, uniform, and investable. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about profit, and she'd weaponized her HOA presidency to make it happen. I thanked Hal, made copies of the permit application, and walked back to my truck. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, letting it all settle. Brenda had abused her authority to help her husband buy land cheaply and set the stage for a luxury development. She'd manipulated her neighbors, inflated fees, and now she was trying to bully me into submission. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd threatened to close Old Mill Road, and in doing that, she'd reminded me who actually owned it. I pulled out the photo of the 1887 map and zoomed in on the notation. Access granted by necessity. I opened my browser and started researching easement law. 20 minutes later, I had my answer. If an alternative access route existed, or could reasonably be created, the necessity clause became void. The landowner could revoke the easement. I looked up the distance between County Road 19 and the western edge of Meadowbrook, 0.3 miles. If the county extended that road another 0.4 miles through public forest land, Meadowbrook would have a direct exit. Old Mill Road would no longer be necessary, and I could legally close it. I started the truck and drove home, my mind working through the implications. Closing that road would cut off 82 families. It would cause chaos, but it would also force Brenda to face the truth. She didn't have the power she thought she did. I did. I pulled into my driveway and looked out at Old Mill Road, that narrow dirt path winding quietly through my property. She'd stood on my land, threatened me, told me she'd make my life hell if I didn't comply, but she hadn't realized what she was standing on. A road I owned, a legal structure built on necessity, and a necessity I could eliminate. I walked into the barn, pulled the old file cabinet open, and took out the 1887 map. I unfolded it on the workbench and stared at it under the dim overhead light. This piece of paper, more than a century old, was about to become the most important document in this fight. Not because it proved I was right, but because it proved she was wrong. She thought she'd trapped me with fines and threats and legal intimidation. But I had the law and the map to set me free. The next morning, I called a property attorney. Not Ed Carlson, my real estate guy, but someone who specialized in easements and land disputes. Hal had recommended her. Her name was Sophie Grant, mid-30s, ran a solo practice out of a small office near the state forest. I explained the situation over the phone, keeping it brief. HOA outside my jurisdiction, threatening fines, husband buying land cheap, development project in the works, and the road running through my property that they now wanted to weaponize. Sophie listened without interrupting, then said, "Bring everything you have. I can see you this afternoon." I drove out at 2 p.m. Her office was a converted house on a quiet street. Wooden sign out front that said Grant Law, Property and Land Use. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Sophie met me at a small conference table, gesturing for me to sit. She wore reading glasses on a chain and had a pen already in hand before I'd even opened my folder. I laid out everything: surveys, the 1887 map, photos of Old Mill Road, screenshots of the Whitmore development permit, and copies of the fine notices. Sophie read through it all without speaking, occasionally making notes in the margins of printed pages. Her focus was absolute. After about 15 minutes, she looked up. "You've got a strong case. Old Mill Road runs through your property. The easement exists, but it's conditional. It only holds as long as there's no other reasonable access. If an alternative route can be built, you have the right to revoke it." I asked if County Road 19 qualified. She pulled up a satellite map on her laptop, zoomed in, and traced the route with her finger. "It's 0.3 miles from the western edge of Meadowbrook. Extending it another 0.4 miles through county forest land is feasible. Flat terrain, no environmental red flags. The cost estimate is around $10,000 to $12,000, 4 to 5 weeks of construction." She tapped the screen. "If you petition the county to build that extension and they approve it, the necessary condition collapses. You'd have full legal authority to close Old Mill Road." Sophie walked me through the process in broad strokes. Petition the county to extend the road. Notify the HOA of my intent. Prepare for a public hearing if Brenda fights back. It would take at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. But then she said something that made me pause. "Graham, if you do this, you need to understand what it means. Closing that road affects 82 families. Most of them had nothing to do with what Brenda's been doing. You'll face backlash. People will call you vindictive. So you need to be clear, in your own mind and in every document we file, that this isn't revenge. It's about protecting your legal rights after being subjected to harassment." I nodded slowly. "I'm not trying to punish innocent people. I just want her to stop." Sophie met my eyes. "Then we make that the foundation of everything we do. You're not attacking, you're defending." We spent the next hour drafting letters and petitions. Sophie's writing was surgical, every sentence precise, every argument airtight. By the time we finished, the documents were ready to file. She sent the letter to the HOA by certified mail and submitted the county petition electronically. "Now we wait," she said. 2 weeks for the county to review. If they move forward, they'll schedule a hearing." I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger, not anxiety, control. That evening, Hal called. He'd heard from a friend in the planning office that my petition was already generating internal buzz. The county had considered extending County Road 19 years ago, but never followed through due to a lack of funding or urgency. Now that someone was formally requesting it and willing to share costs, they were taking it seriously. Hal also mentioned something else. A woman named Karen Reynolds, a Meadowbrook resident, had reached out asking about me. She'd heard rumors I was planning to close the road and wanted to know the truth. Hal gave her my number. She called 20 minutes later. Her voice was hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure if I'd answer. "Mr. Hayes, my name is Karen Reynolds. I live in Meadowbrook. I'm not calling to argue with you. I just want to understand what's happening." I told her the short version. The fines, the harassment, the development project, the road. She listened quietly. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Brenda raised our HOA fees from $150 a month to $300. She said it was for infrastructure improvements. But nothing's improved. The roads are the same. The landscaping's the same. And when a few of us asked where the money was going, she shut us down, threatened fines if we kept questioning her." Karen's voice tightened. "I didn't know about the development project. None of us did. But it explains everything." I asked if she'd be willing to speak publicly if this went to a hearing. There was a long pause. Then she said, "Yes, if you can prove she's been abusing her position, I'll back you up. And I'm not the only one. A lot of people in this neighborhood are tired of her. I thanked her. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a while, letting it sink in. For years, Brenda had ruled through intimidation and silence. But the moment someone stood up, the structure started to crack. People who'd been afraid to speak were suddenly willing to act. I looked out at Old Mill Road, that narrow strip of dirt winding quietly through my land. I didn't want to close it. But I'd learned something in 12 years as a lawyer. Sometimes the threat of action is more powerful than the action itself. Sometimes, just showing you're willing to enforce your rights is enough to stop someone from trampling them. Brenda thought she could bully me into submission because she'd done it to everyone else. But she'd miscalculated. I wasn't everyone else, and this wasn't about winning. It was about drawing a line. She'd crossed onto my property, threatened my livelihood, and tried to bend me to her will. Now I was going to show her what happened when you pushed someone who understood the system better than you did. This wasn't vengeance. It was balanced. Sophie's letter reached the HOA on a Thursday morning. I knew because I got the delivery confirmation email at 9:47 a.m. Brenda's response came 3 hours later. Not to me, but through her attorney. A law firm out of the city. Corporate letterhead. The kind of place that charges $400 an hour to write threatening emails. The letter was addressed to me, copied to Sophie. It opened with a denial of all wrongdoing, claimed the HOA had every right to enforce community standards on properties that impact the visual and economic integrity of the neighborhood, and warned that any attempt to close Old Mill Road would be met with immediate legal action. The tone was aggressive, designed to intimidate. It ended with a demand that I withdraw my petition within 5 business days or face a lawsuit. I forwarded it to Sophie without comment. She called me 10 minutes later. "They're panicking. This letter is all bluster. They have no standing to sue you for closing a road on your property, especially if an alternative exists. This is theater." I asked what we should do. Sophie's voice was calm, almost amused. "We ignore it, and we move forward." And 2 days later, the county planning department sent a preliminary approval notice. They'd reviewed my petition, confirmed that extending County Road 19 was feasible, and scheduled a public hearing for 3 weeks out. The county would handle permits and environmental clearances. All affected parties, including Meadowbrook Estates HOA, would be notified and allowed to comment. I read the notice once, filed it, and felt something settle inside me. This was real now, not just a threat, a process. Sophie told me to gather every piece of evidence I had. Photos, documents, emails, the fine notices, the development permit. We were going to build a case, not just about property rights, but about misuse of authority, about a system weaponized for private gain. That same afternoon, I drafted my own letter, not through Sophie, just from me. I sent it directly to the Meadowbrook HOA board. All 5 members listed on their website. The letter was short. I'd been subjected to baseless fines despite owning property outside their jurisdiction. I had a legal right to revoke the easement if an alternative route was built. And I made one thing clear. I wasn't doing this to hurt residents. I was doing this to stop the harassment. If the HOA withdrew the fines and acknowledged I wasn't under their authority, I'd reconsider. If they kept threatening me, I'd move forward. I sent the letter by email. Within 2 hours, I got responses from 3 of the 5 board members. Not Brenda. She stayed silent, but the others didn't. 1. A man named David Sterling said he hadn't known about the fines and was concerned about recent decisions. Another, Patricia Holm, wanted to meet in person. The third simply said, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." I forwarded all 3 to Sophie. She called immediately. "Graham, this is huge. Board members are breaking ranks. That seldom happens unless they're worried about liability. Brenda's losing her grip." I asked what that meant for us. Sophie said it meant we had momentum. If board members questioned her decisions publicly, it would undermine her entire defense. At the hearing, if even one of them contradicts her, she's done. The next morning, Brenda made her move. She called an emergency HOA meeting, scheduled for Saturday at 10 a.m. The subject line read, "Critical infrastructure issue, mandatory attendance encouraged." I wasn't invited, but Karen Reynolds was, and she called me Friday night to tell me what she'd heard. Brenda was planning to frame me as a hostile neighbor, trying to cut off the community out of spite. She was going to rally the neighborhood against me before the public hearing. Karen's voice was tense. She's going to make you the villain. Graham. I told her that was fine. Let Brenda say what she wanted. The facts would speak at the hearing. But Karen pushed back. A lot of people here don't know the full story. If Brenda controls the narrative first, it'll be harder to win them over later. You need to get ahead of this. I thought about it. Then I asked if she'd be willing to speak at the meeting, not to defend me, but to ask questions, to demand transparency, to force Brenda into the open. Karen hesitated. If I do that, she'll come after me. Fines, violations, everything, I said. I know, but if you don't, no one else will. There was a long silence. Then she said, okay, I'll do it. Saturday morning came. I stayed home, worked on the property, tried not to think about what was happening a mile away, but at 11:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was Karen. Her voice was shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline. Graham, you need to hear what just happened. She told me Brenda had opened with a presentation. Maps, printed copies of my petition, framing the whole thing as an attack on the community. She'd said I was using the road as ransom, trying to extort the HOA into paying me off. Halfway through, Karen had raised her hand and asked a simple question. Mrs. Whitmore, is it true Mr. Hayes's property is outside HOA jurisdiction? Brenda had tried to deflect. Karen pressed. Is it true your husband bought 4 parcels of land here at below market prices from board members? The room had gone silent. Brenda's face had turned red. She'd said it was none of Karen's business. Karen had stood. It's absolutely my business. You raised our fees. You're threatening our neighbor. And your husband is buying land cheaply from people you work with. That's a conflict of interest. The meeting had unraveled after that. Other residents started asking questions. Where was the fee increase money going? Why hadn't they been told about the development project? Why was the HOA harassing someone who wasn't a member? Brenda had tried to regain control, but the room had turned. By the time it ended, half the crowd was demanding a financial audit. Some were talking about replacing the board. Karen's voice was still buzzing. Graham, you didn't just crack her defenses, you shattered them. I thanked her, hung up, and sat on the porch for a long time. Brenda had tried to turn the neighborhood against me. Instead, she'd exposed herself. The public hearing was still 3 weeks away, but the battlefield had shifted. I wasn't the outsider anymore. I was the catalyst, and Brenda, for all her authority and legal threats, had just learned something she should have known from the start. Authority built on fear only lasts until someone refuses to be afraid. She'd built her kingdom on silence. Today, it finally broke. The public hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the County Administration Building, a squat brick structure downtown with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors that squeaked when you walked. Sophie and I arrived early, around 6:30, and set up at one of the long tables near the front. We had everything we needed: maps, surveys, fines, permits, photos, timeline. Sophie arranged them in neat stacks, labeled and indexed, like we were preparing for trial. She was calm, methodical, and dressed in a dark suit. I wore a button-down shirt and jeans, the same thing I'd wear to fix a fence. I wasn't trying to look like a lawyer. I was trying to look like what I was. By 6:45, people started filing in. County planning staff took seats at the front table, along with 3 members of the Board of Supervisors. Then came the residents of Meadowbrook, older couples, young families, people who'd lived there for years and had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. Karen walked in with a small group and gave me a quick nod. She'd been talking to neighbors all week, showing them the permit, the land sales, the fee increases. Not everyone believed her, but enough did. And they were here. At 6:55, Brenda arrived. She walked in with her attorney, a man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. Brenda wore a navy blazer and carried a leather folder. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me at all. She took a seat on the opposite side of the room and stared straight ahead like she was bracing for impact. The hearing began at 7 p.m. sharp. The chairwoman of the Board of Supervisors, Ellen Morrison, called the room to order and explained the process. This was a public hearing to consider extending County Road 19 to provide alternative access to Meadowbrook Estates. All parties would present their case. Then the board would deliberate. Ellen looked at me. "Mr. Hayes, you filed the petition. You'll present first." I stood up, walked to the podium, and took a breath. This wasn't just about a road. It was about whether someone could abuse authority without consequences. I started by introducing myself. Explained that I'd bought a farm outside Meadowbrook specifically because it wasn't part of an HOA. Showed the property survey. Pointed out the 400 feet of separation between my land and theirs. Then I showed the fine notices, $12,500 for things I had no legal obligation to comply with. I read excerpts aloud. Unauthorized agricultural structure, prohibited livestock, non-compliant landscaping. I looked up at the board. I was fined for having a barn, chickens, and a tractor on my own land. I moved on to Old Mill Road, showed the 1887 map, explained the conditional easement. Then I showed the final piece, the Whitmore Development Permit application, the $3.2 million resort project. The land purchases are at 40% below market. I didn't editorialize. I just put the facts on the screen. Then I said the part Sophie and I had worked hardest on. I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here because I was harassed and threatened by someone who abused her position. I've tried to resolve this privately. It didn't work. So now I'm asking the county to provide an alternative route so I can exercise my legal right to control my own property. I sat down. The room was silent. Ellen nodded and looked to the other side. "Mrs. Whitmore, you may present." Brenda stood, her attorney beside her, and walked to the podium. She didn't use notes. "Thank you. Chairwoman Morrison, what we're seeing tonight is an attempt by Mr. Hayes to hold a community hostage over a personal grievance. Old Mill Road has been the primary access for Meadowbrook for over 40 years. 82 families depend on it. Closing it would disrupt emergency services, school buses, and daily life. It would create a safety hazard." She gestured to the crowd behind her. "These are real people who did nothing wrong. Mr. Hayes is using his property as a weapon." Her attorney stepped forward and added legal language about established use and community reliance. It was polished, persuasive, and it ignored every fact I'd just presented. When they finished, Ellen opened the floor for public comment. Karen stood first. She walked to the podium, hands shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. "My name is Karen Reynolds. I've lived in Meadowbrook for 10 years. I didn't know about the fines. I didn't know about the development project. I didn't know my fees were raised to $300 a month with no accounting, but now I do. And I want to know where that money went. I support Mr. Hayes." 3 other residents stood after Karen. 2 supported me. 1 opposed, worried about the road closure. Then David Sterling, the board member who'd emailed me, stood up. He didn't come to the podium. He just spoke from his seat, voice tight. "I need to say something. I sold land to Thomas Whitmore 8 months ago. Brenda told me privately it was an investment opportunity, that if I sold at a reduced price, I'd benefit from the resort later. I agreed because I trusted her, but I never disclosed it. And I didn't know she was using HOA authority to pressure others. I regret that." The room erupted. People started talking over each other. Brenda's face went white. Her attorney grabbed her arm, whispered something urgent. Ellen banged the gavel. "Order!" She looked at Brenda. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you wish to respond?" Brenda stood slowly. Her voice was quieter now. "Mr. Sterling's statements are taken out of context. My husband's business is separate from my HOA duties." Ellen cut her off. "We'll consider that. This hearing is now closed. The board will issue a decision within 2 weeks." People filed out slowly. Karen came over, hugged me without saying a word. Hal clapped me on the shoulder. Sophie packed up the documents, her face unreadable. But I could tell she was satisfied. As we walked out to the parking lot, I looked back and saw Brenda standing alone near her car, her attorney already gone. She looked smaller somehow, not defeated yet, but shaken. For the first time. She'd been forced to answer in front of the people she'd claimed to represent, and she hadn't had an answer. I got in my truck and drove home under a sky full of stars. The decision would come in 2 weeks, but something had already changed. She'd spent years building walls of silence around her authority. Tonight, those walls had cracks, and everyone had seen them. For the first time, her silence had weight. 2 days after the hearing, The local newspaper ran a story. The headline read, HOA President Faces Conflict of Interest. Questions after development ties exposed. The article summarized the hearing, quoted David Sterling's testimony, and noted that several Meadowbrook residents had requested a financial audit of HOA funds. Brenda's name was now publicly tied to accusations of self-dealing for someone who'd built her reputation on control. That was a death sentence. I read it over coffee that morning, sitting on the porch. The story was fair, factual, and damaging. I didn't feel triumphant, I just felt tired. This had taken months, cost me sleep and money, and pulled me into a fight I never wanted. But it was almost over. I could feel it. That same afternoon, Karen called. Her voice was breathless. Graham, there's an emergency HOA meeting tonight. The other board members called it. They're voting on whether to remove Brenda as president. I asked if she was going. Karen said she wouldn't miss it. I told her to call me after. I didn't go myself. I'd done my part. This was their fight now. At 8:30 p.m., my phone rang. It was Karen. She's done, Graham. They voted her out. 7-2. Brenda tried to defend herself, saying everything was legal, that the hearing was a misunderstanding, but nobody bought it. Patricia Holm read a statement on behalf of the board. They said Brenda had created legal liability, failed to disclose conflicts, and damaged the community's reputation. They asked for her resignation. She refused, so they removed her by vote. Karen paused. She walked out without saying a word, just grabbed her things and left. I sat back, processing it. Brenda Whitmore, who'd ruled Meadowbrook for 4 years, who'd threatened me and tried to destroy me, was gone. Not because I'd fought her directly, but because her own community had turned on her once they saw what she really was. Karen kept talking. They also voted to rescind all fines against you, unanimously, and they're drafting a formal letter acknowledging your property is outside HOA jurisdiction. Graham, it's over. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd survived, but I thanked her anyway. 3 days later, Sophie called. The county had issued its decision. The petition to extend County Road 19 had been approved, with construction starting in 4 weeks. Once finished, Meadowbrook would have direct access, eliminating the necessity for Old Mill Road. Sophie's voice was steady. Graham, you can legally close that road as soon as the new route is done. You did it. I thanked her, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the decision she'd emailed. I had the authority now, the legal power to close the road, to make Brenda's worst fears real. But I didn't want to. That had never been the point. The next morning, I drafted a letter to Patricia Holm, the new HOA president. I acknowledged the board's decision to rescind the fines and recognize my property rights. Then I made an offer. I would not close Old Mill Road. I would continue to allow access, free of charge, as long as the HOA respected my boundaries. I sent the letter by email. Patricia responded within an hour. Mr. Hayes, on behalf of Meadowbrook Estates, we accept with gratitude. Thank you for your grace. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. It was done. That evening, Hal called. He'd heard the county had opened an investigation into the Whitmore development land purchases, looking into whether Brenda had used her position to facilitate deals. It could take months, but if they found evidence, there could be charges. I told him I wasn't interested in what happened next. Hal laughed. You don't have to be. The system's doing it for you now. A week later, a for sale sign went up on Brenda's property. Word around town was that she and Thomas were moving out of state, trying to get ahead of the investigation. She didn't fall. She was voted out. Quietly. Finally. I didn't feel good about it. I didn't feel bad either. I just felt like the weight I'd been carrying for months had finally lifted. Karen stopped by the farm one afternoon with vegetables from her garden. We sat on the porch, drank iced tea, and didn't talk about Brenda or the HOA. We talked about soil and chickens and the weather, normal things. Before she left, she said, a lot of people were saying you were difficult at first. Now they're saying you stood up when no one else would. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. After she left, I walked down to Old Mill Road. That narrow strip of dirt, the center of so much conflict, is now just a quiet path through my property. I stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and gold. Brenda had tried to use this road as leverage, had threatened to close it. had dangled it over me like a weapon. And in the end, it hadn't been the road that mattered. It had been the principle, the ability to say no, the refusal to be controlled. I'd won that fight not by shutting anyone out, but by proving I could. The county would build its new road. Life in Meadowbrook would go on. And I'd keep living the way I'd always wanted to. On my own land, on my own terms. I looked down at the worn tire tracks cutting through the dirt and realized something. It wasn't the road that changed. It was me. 2 months after the hearing, I received an official letter from the county district attorney's office. After investigating the land transactions between Thomas Whitmore and members of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board, they'd determined that Brenda Whitmore had violated conflict of interest statutes by using her position to facilitate below-market sales that benefited her husband's company. She was fined $15,000, ordered to reimburse the HOA $83,000 in unaccounted fees, and banned from holding any community management position for 5 years. Thomas wasn't charged criminally, but the tax office flagged his purchases and assessed him $47,000 in back taxes and penalties. The letter concluded with a statement that the case was closed. I read it once, folded it, and put it in the file cabinet in the barn, next to the 1887 map. Justice, slow and bureaucratic as it was, had been served. That same week, the new HOA board held its first official meeting under Patricia Holmes' leadership. Karen attended and called me afterward. The board had voted to reduce monthly fees back to $150, implemented transparent quarterly financial reports, and established a formal complaint process requiring documentation before fines could be issued. Patricia had announced a community meeting to rebuild trust and encourage resident participation. Karen said the mood was cautiously optimistic. People were tired of conflict. They wanted stability, fairness, a neighborhood that felt like home again. I told her I was glad to hear it. I'd never wanted to destroy Meadowbrook. Now they were fixing the system that had let someone like Brenda abuse power in the first place. A few weeks later, construction on the County Road 19 extension began. I drove out one morning to watch the crew working. Heavy equipment, gravel trucks, and surveyors marking the route. The project manager said they were ahead of schedule and expected to finish in 4 weeks. By mid-November, the road would be complete. Meadowbrook would have a direct, paved connection to the highway. Old Mill Road would no longer be necessary, but I wasn't going to close it. The road was mine. The choice was mine, and I'd made it. One Saturday afternoon, Hal stopped by with a bottle of whiskey. We sat on the porch, poured a glass each, and he raised his in a quiet toast. "To property rights," he said. I clinked my glass against his, and to people who know when to use them. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the chickens peck around the yard. Hal eventually said, "You know, Graham, most people in your situation would have either folded or gone nuclear. You did neither. You stood your ground, used the system the way it's supposed to work, and didn't burn the place down. That takes discipline." I shrugged. I just didn't want to become the thing I was fighting. Hal nodded slowly, understanding. We finished our drinks, talked about nothing important, and he left as the sun started to set. I stayed on the porch a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened. It had taken 6 months. 6 months of stress, legal fees, sleepless nights, but it was over, and I was still here, still on my land, still free. A week before Thanksgiving, I got a handwritten letter in the mail. It was from Patricia Holmes, written on plain stationery. She thanked me for allowing the easement to remain open, said the new road was nearly finished and that the community was grateful. Then she wrote, "You didn't just stand up for yourself, Mr. Hayes. You held up a mirror to all of us. We saw what we'd become under the previous leadership, and we didn't like it. Because of you, we're building something better." I read the letter twice, then set it on the kitchen table. Something good had come out of the conflict, not just for me, but for them too. They had their community back. The county finished the road extension 2 days before Thanksgiving. There was no ceremony, just a notification that County Road 19 was open. Meadowbrook residents started using it immediately. I drove out to see it one morning, followed the new route all the way to the highway. It was smooth, well-marked, and safe. Old Mill Road, by comparison, was still the same narrow dirt path, quiet, unremarkable, no longer the center of anyone's attention. I stood at the junction where the two roads met and realized the fight had never been about the road. It had been about respect, boundaries, the right to exist on your own terms. I'd won by refusing to be controlled. I got back in my truck and drove home. The farm was waiting. Chickens needed feeding. The fence needs mending. Life, simple and uncomplicated, was calling me back. I parked near the barn and walked out to the field, boots crunching over dry grass, the air cool and clean. Overhead, a hawk circled slowly and easily, riding a thermal current. The sun fell over the fields, steady and honest. For once, nothing needed defending. Spring came early that year. By late March, the fields were already turning green. The apple tree near the barn was blooming, and the chickens were laying more eggs than I knew what to do with. I'd spent the winter quietly, working the land, fixing things that needed fixing, and letting the noise of the previous year fade into memory. The farm felt different now, not just peaceful, but mine in a way it hadn't been before. I'd fought for it, earned it, and now I could finally enjoy it without looking over my shoulder. One morning in early April, I decided to do something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I was going to build a new gate at the entrance to my property. The old one was functional but plain, just a basic farm gate that had been there when I bought the place. I wanted something better, something that marked the land as mine, but also welcomed the people who passed through. I spent a weekend cutting timber, sanding it smooth, and assembling the frame. I carved a sign by hand, letters burned into a piece of oak. Hayes Farm, established 2024. Simple, honest, true, on a Saturday afternoon. I invited a few people over for what I was calling, half-jokingly, the gate opening. Karen came, along with a few other neighbors from Meadowbrook who'd supported me during the fight. Hal showed up with his wife, and Sophie drove out from town. Patricia Holm came too, bringing a basket of homemade bread as a thank you gift. We didn't make it a big ceremony. No speeches, no formalities, just a small gathering of people who'd been part of the story, standing together on a warm spring day. I opened the gate wide, propped it with a stone so it wouldn't swing shut, and said a few words. This gate's here to remind me that boundaries matter, but so does openness. I built this place to be free, and that means free to decide when to stand firm and when to let people in. Thanks for being here. Thanks for standing with me when it mattered. People clapped. Not loud or dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement. We ate lunch on the porch, talked about gardens and weather, and nothing heavy. It felt good, normal, like life had finally returned to what it was supposed to be, after everyone left. I walked down to Old Mill Road one last time. It was still there, still open, still quiet. Cars passed through occasionally, neighbors heading home from work or running errands. Nobody honked, nobody waved. It was just a road again. Nothing more, nothing less. I stood there for a while, hands in my pockets, watching the light filter through the trees. A year ago, this road had been the center of a war I didn't start. Now it was just part of the landscape, part of my land, part of my life. I thought about Brenda, wherever she was now. I didn't know if she'd learned anything from what happened. Maybe she blamed me. Maybe she blamed herself. Maybe she didn't think about it at all. It didn't matter anymore. She'd lost her position, her reputation, and whatever control she thought she had. And I'd gained something I didn't expect. Not just my property rights, but my confidence, my voice, the knowledge that I could stand up to power, even small, petty power, and win. Not by being louder or meaner, but by being smarter, calmer, and more patient. By using the system the way it was designed to be used. By refusing to bend. I walked back to the house as the sun started to dip. The barn door creaked in the wind. The chickens clucked softly in their coop. Everything was exactly as it should be. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sky turn pink and orange. This place, this farm, this life. It was everything I'd hoped it would be when I bought it. Peace, space, freedom, and now, finally, I had it. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I'd defended it. The gate stood open at the end of the driveway, a quiet symbol of everything I'd learned. Boundaries aren't walls, they're lines you draw to protect what matters. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is know exactly where those lines are and refused to let anyone cross them without permission. I finished my coffee, set the mug down, and looked out over the land one more time. It wasn't perfect. The fence still needed work. The barn roof had a leak I'd been putting off. There was always something, but it was mine, every inch of it, and that was enough. If you've ever stood up to an HOA or dealt with someone who tried to control your own property, you're not alone. Subscribe to HOA Chronicles for more real stories of people fighting back and winning. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment with your story.